almost, hello, we had permission to tell our stories. And we'd all kind of assumed as helicopter pilots that we'd all kind of done the same thing. And yet it was extraordinary to hear about people who had gone head to head with Argentine jets. There was a Lynx went head to head with a Mirage. Wessex went head to head with a couple of Skyhawks and watched the bombs come off the rails, and the bombs mercifully didn't go off. We had one of my colleagues went head to head with a Bukhara and lived to tell the tale. He escaped into the cloud, which was a good place to go. He wouldn't have lasted much longer otherwise. And we heard about amazing stories of rescues. And I thought, blimey, you know, I was there and I didn't know half of this stuff. And so I thought the grain of an idea began to form that I should write a book about it. So I took it upon myself to interview about 40 colleagues and ended up with this thing, which we published about 10 years ago. My son has just, who's a young actor, has just narrated the audio version. So it's just about to pop up on Audible and other platforms. And he's done a bloody good job, actually. And I thought it would be more fun for a 19-year-old to speak the part, because it was kind of nearer the age range than I am now. And anyway, so that will appear in due course. If anyone wants a copy of the book, I grabbed some copies from the publisher. I think I grabbed the last ones, actually, and I've got some at the back afterwards. Okay, so there's sweet little 21-year-old me, looking very pretty. We all flew in boom mic, throat mics in those days. With these sort of strange metallic sounding, it gave a metallic edge to your voice, very peculiar. But you kind of got used to it. And we also flew in the Falklands, that's me in the Falklands. We flew in our wellies, which was marvelous. Someone was abusing the green wellies earlier today. I think the general was having a go at welly wearers. Well, we all flew in wellies because we thought that was very sensible. And actually, it was a good thing we did. So I'm here to talk about the role of helicopters in the Falklands, and you can see the problem. The problem was one of logistics, an 88,000-mile supply line, which was really important. General Omar Bradley famously on D-Day was reported to have said that amateurs talk about strategy, but professionals talk about logistics. And it was really a game of logistics to get everybody there and keep everyone fueled up and ammunitioned up and fed and watered and clothed and still alive. And that's mostly what we did as helicopter crews. We moved stuff and people around. So that's in a nutshell the talk, so I can sit down now. Thanks. Thank you very much indeed. Anyway, so let's start with some of the machines that were involved in the war out at sea, which doesn't terribly interest me because I was a commando jungly pilot, so I was much more interested in the land war. But out at sea, we had anti-submarine Sea Kings. This is a Mark V. You can tell by the sort of square radome on its back and its retractable wheels. The wheels are actually out at that moment. There were Mark II and Mark V Sea Kings based at sea on the various ships. There were also a couple of Wessex 3s. This is the one on Antrim, which famously rescued a whole bunch of people off the glacier at South Georgia. And that's also got a radar, and that was used for anti-submarine work. Lynxes, young Ray over there flew a lynx off Broadsword and Antelope. I think he was sunk twice. So it was not a good person to be around in the Falklands. So that's a lynx, and they were based on small ships. And then the other seaborne helicopter, that's actually me, subsequently flying a Wasp with a Mark 46 torpedo off HMS Apollo, which didn't go to the Falklands. So then the land-based helicopters, Mark IV Sea Kings, you can tell the difference between, apart from the color, that they're painted jungly green rather than blue. They don't have a radome on the back, and they don't have retractable wheels. And they just have sort of flop cans on the wheels in case they go in the sea. This is off the coast of Ascension Island. One of the things that happened literally the day before the fleet set off from Portsmouth and Plymouth, some of the 846 Sea King pilots went up to Farnborough to see a guy called Mike Spencer, who would subsequently join my squadron as a Wessex pilot. He was a test pilot at Farnborough. And he handed over and gave a demo of 7 sets of night vision goggles. They'd never been used before in British military helicopters, to my knowledge. And these night vision goggles, just 7 sets, proved to be extremely useful, particularly to Colonel Rhodes, as he was then, and his team. And that's the great and mighty Wessex 5, which I flew and Hector flew. It's got an X on the side, so it's an 847 Squadron Wessex. So it could be me, or it could be anybody really, who knows. And in fact, once our squadron arrived, we mixed and matched crews between any of the Wessex pilots. There were 3 or 2.5 squadrons of Wessex pilots, and we rotated crews, so it didn't matter who you flew with. There were also what were called the teeny weenies, the gazelles, which were used for reconnaissance and flown by the 3 Brigade Air Squadron, and also scouts flown by 3 Brigade Air Squadron. They could be fitted with SS-11 anti-tank missiles, and I think they were fired in anger at a house on the way. Graham's nodding. I think they were when the advance to Fitzroy took place. I think they fired at a house then. And that picture gives a pretty good view of what it was like at the time on the side of Mount Longdon or Two Sisters or Harriet or these final hills. Quite an atmospheric photo. I like that one very much. And then finally, and very importantly, the Chinook, the one Chinook that survived from the sinking of the Atlantic Conveyor, Bravo November. They did an absolutely amazing job. And this picture is of them carrying 4 large containers of fuel that were known to all as bollocks. I think there were 2,000 pounds or 2,000 kilos, 2,000 pounds of fuel in each. And those flown up to the front line to Fitzroy, to the forward bases at Fitzroy and Teal, where I was based at the end, were an absolute lifesaver, because the Wessex could operate. There were about 25 Wessex on the islands in the last week, and we could operate with a payload of about 3,000 pounds or thereabouts. So you could carry 2,500 pounds worth of troops and 500 pounds of fuel, or the reverse. You could carry 2,400 pounds of fuel and 600 pounds of troop, and that was about it. So it made sense not to have to trog all the way back to St. Carlos from the front line. And these portable fuel bowsers effectively really saved us and allowed us to operate a lot more effectively on the front line. Where are we going? How do we get there? We got there on, this will be Fearless, and I know that because it's got 846 Mark IV Sea Kings on the back. Intrepid took Wessex down to the Falklands. So there are lots of HMSs. That's 2 pictures that I took of HMS Hermes, looking somewhat weather beaten after about a month in the South Atlantic. I took this in early June. At the back of the ship, you can see a Wessex 5, a Lynx, a Mark II Sea King with a smaller radome, and then at the front there's a Mark V Sea King parked at the front next to the ski jump, and then a whole bunch of Sea Harriers on deck, with one looking like it's about to launch. I can't remember that. But Hermes basically didn't like helicopters because they were quite rightly focused on the Harriers. And so if you got anywhere near Hermes, you were jolly lucky to get a landing slot. And if you got onto the deck, you were usually told to stay there for an abnormally long amount of time before you were allowed to get off, because everything was focused on Harriers, quite rightly so. This is HMS Antrim, which took a Mark III Wessex, you can see on the left, the single engine Wessex 3, and on the right is Mark V Wessex. Probably doesn't exist anymore, actually. I should think that's one of the ones that's still stuck up on the top of Fortuna Glacier, working its way down at a glacial pace. A lot of helicopters were taken on these ships taken up from trade, stuffed, and this is the MV Elk with an 846 Sea King on the back. You can again tell it's an 846 Sea King because of the lack of radome, the green color, and the non-retractable wheels. This is a Wessex 5 of 848 squadron, which has got a W as its marking, so it's 848, and that must be on Atlantic Conveyor. And you can see how blooming tight the deck was at the back. It's pretty terrifying. I never landed on that, but I think you have to have some balls to be able to get in there with the Wessex part so close, and then that huge flap at the back. Sorry, good naval jargon there, flap. There's probably some nautical term for it, but I have no idea what. I can do left and right, and that's about it. And then this is 825 Sea Kings, which were anti-submarine Sea Kings stripped out and stripped of their internal sonar kit, and they were switched to they became sort of overnight junglies. Although of course, obviously, we thought, they're not going to be able to hack it because they're all pingers. But actually, they did a bloody good job. This is them unloading the QE2 off the coast of South Georgia before they then sailed in. This is what we went to war on, a thing called Engadine, which was used mostly as a helicopter training ship for the pingers. And then we plonked 4 Wessex 5 on the back. You can see how tight the spots are, and you can just make out what's called the bum line, which you fly when you come into land on a ship. You start in the hover next to a ship, and then you fly your bum along this white line and that means that you're not going to hit anything. And so you could have a Wessex at the front and a Wessex at the back, and they're not going to collide so long as you stick to the bum line. So that was pretty important. The weather was like that all the way, not. This is the doldrums south of Ascension Island. We had 1 or 2 really marvelous days, and of course we weren't able to stop and go swimming, but we could have done, because this thing went so bloody slowly. We could have swum faster and caught up. 12 knots. It took us forever to get down there. We thought we were going to miss it. We set off late. We arrived late. I mean, honestly, it was awful. And there's me flying my 7-ton beast, which was tremendous fun. And actually, I really learned to master deck landings on Engadine on the way south. And it was a skill that you did end up mastering, and we got really good at it. And I think I've got 800 or so to my name now. I put this one in because it's rather fun. Well, it's also awful because it's fun because you can see the 1980s shorts. So we all had very, very tight shorts, tremendous. So this is the cultural moment here. We played a lot of deck hockey on the way south. And sadly, 3 of those gentlemen at the front are no longer with us. Dolly Gray was an air crewman, Al Doughty an air crewman, and then Major Adrian Short, one of our pilots. And they're all no longer with us, appallingly. But there we go. So that's enough of the entertainment. The war really happened in 3 phases. There's 3 parts. There's the sort of the prelude bit, which was getting the political victory of South Georgia, which was important to show that we were able to do something. And then we had the Sea War, which was 3 weeks from the when was it, the beginning of May till the 21st of May, getting sea supremacy. And then the Land War took another 3 weeks from the 21st of May until the 14th of June. So it started off with the South Georgia and the SAS in inimitable gung-ho style. I use the word gung-ho now that the general's out of the room, although I fear, sir, that you will hear this on the Zoom thing a bit later. But anyway, it was a gung-ho operation against all of the recommendations of the Arctic-trained pilots and the Antarctic-trained pilots, who said that going into South Georgia onto the top of a glacier was absolute. You had to be an absolute nutter to go on it. And so it proved. They dropped them off with 2 Wessex 5s and a Wessex 3. And this gives an indication of the sort of scale of the cliffs that they were up against. And then you throw in 80-mile-an-hour winds, and you throw in a glacier. And needless to say, overnight, the SAS decided to call it a day. They weren't going to be able to walk around the back and attack Grytviken from the rear in sort of Lawrence of Arabia style. So they called for rescue, and these our colleagues were sent in to go and rescue them. And that was the result, was that both of these Wessex 5s ended up crashing. Amazingly, nobody was killed. And there was an extraordinary rescue by Wessex 3, which had to go back a second time. So it had to go in with these guys. And they split the crew and passengers in the first Wessex. And then the second Wessex crashed, and the Wessex 3 had to fly all the way back to her ship. And then faced the horrifying thought of going back, not knowing whether anyone was still alive in the second crash. But mercifully, no one was killed, and they all got off. It was the most extraordinary rescue, and I just don't even want to think about how horrifying it must have been for the flying. So the Falklands, you've all seen maps, so I'm not going to linger on that. Let's talk a little bit about the sort of before the landing. The Seeking Mark IVs were heavily involved with their night vision goggles in a number of different types of missions. First of all, was that they inserted SAS patrols in West Falkland and East Falkland, and SBS patrols as well, some to spot for aircraft and some to survey where the Argentine troops were or weren't, you know, on Mount Kent around Stanley, Wireless Ridge, etc. The navigation in those days was not kind of like, you know, with one of these things, which is amazing, and you just look at it and it tells you where you are in the world. We hadn't a clue where we were unless the ship told us where we were. And so what they did then, they had a thing called TANS on the Sea Kings, and it was an inertial-based navigation system. So basically a gyro that sticks and points up in the air. And that thing would gradually drift over time, so an error would creep in. So what they did was that by flying 3 Sea Kings at once in towards the Falklands, they would correct by averaging out the errors on the 3 machines, hoping like mad they hadn't all gone in the same direction, which was always a possibility. But if they'd all spun off in slightly different, then you can plonk yourself in the middle of the triangle, and that was clever. They also found their way in by aligning with a thing called Concordia Point, which was a distinctive rock on the north end of East Falkland. And that helped them to navigate in, and they did an amazing job, and their timing and their navigation were second to none, even though we're our sister squadron, so how can I say that? But anyway, so the second thing that they did was that they did the raid on Pebble Island, or the SAS troops were inserted into Pebble Island in a night raid using goggles again, and then picked up afterwards. These are Pucaras. All the way through the war, the one thing that we were all said to each other is, where are the Pucaras? You see, it was, if you had a jet coming at you, we used to practice flying against jets. You only ever were likely to get one pass of a jet, because as I'm sure Neil will tell us later, they'd have one crack at us because we were an opportunity target and then move on. So provided you could escape from the jet first time round, and hopefully it would overshoot, then you were okay. But these things could go slowly, and they could go at, you know, 90 or 100 knots. And that terrified us, because they would then sit on our tail, and that would be the end, that would be curtains. So it was jolly good that the Pucaras were dispatched. Several at Goose Green were blown up. These ones at Pebble Island, the weather did in a few, crashes did in some more, and I think there were 3 left in flying condition. Some of them did fly in the last week of the war. I thankfully never saw one. Only one of my colleagues actually saw one head to head with one. And the Pucaras did shoot down a scout. I think it was just after the Battle of Goose Green. The other scout that was with them landed very sensibly and got away with it. So that is, where are we? Here we go. That's that. The other thing that the Sea Kings did was they had a secret raid into Chile to go and have a look at the, into Argentina, the southern tip of Argentina, to go and look at the base at Rio Grande, which is where the Superétendards were launching from with their exocets, and whether they were going to go and attack it or observe or what, who knows. I should have asked the general, but anyway, that mission didn't come off. They ended up flying a one-way mission. They went out. They decided to abandon the mission, went into Chile to Punta Arenas, and torched the helicopter there, and hung around on the ground for about a week before coming home. So the landings took place. This is the broad setup of where the helicopters were based at San Carlos. And they gathered, you know, at the beginning, there was very few helicopters. There were a few Sea Kings, Hector's Wessex, Ray's Lynx. There were a few others around. There was a Wasp with the Wessex 3, but not very many helicopters at the beginning. By the time we got to the last week, there were 20 Sea Kings of different types, of Mark IIs and Mark IVs. There were 25 of us Wessex 5s, and a whole bunch, and some teeny weenies as well. So there were the Scouts and the Gazelles. So we had to spread them around the place. And so some were at Port San Carlos. We were based at Port San Carlos, which is the top one. And then others were based down in San Carlos, further down south. And also Ajax Bay was where the field hospital was, with most of the logistic supplies. This is a photo on D-Day. You've all seen it. We've talked about it before, so I'll move on. You can see actually just one helicopter over the top of Canberra. And there were really very few helicopters around. Hector was there, and perhaps we'll tell you about it a bit later when we have the panel. He's got some very exciting stories. This is 2 Mark IV Sea Kings on the lifting some loads off Canberra. And in fact, this is Hector's helicopter picking up some casualties on what looks like it could be Fanning Head or somewhere like that. And that was the only Wessex 5 around on D-Day. Parking. What happened with parking? Sorry, not parking. When the air raids came in, and I wasn't there, I wasn't in St. Carlos during any of the air raids. When the air raids came in, the first thing that happened was that they called air raid warning over the radio, and the helicopters went to ground, but they went to ground too soon, so they were wasting time. And they realized that very quickly. And then the reverse error happened, that they were waiting until the jets were coming over the top of the hill, and then we're going to ground. And then they had a problem of whether you go to ground quite close to the coast so that you're staying close to your tasking, to the ships that you're seeking to unload. Do you stay close to the coast, close to the ships, which puts you at risk from being shot by your own side? Indeed, one of our helicopters, the dreaded Yankee Tango, which us junior Joes got to fly, we got to fly it for a good reason, because our ships put a bullet hole in the windscreen of Yankee Tango while it was sitting waiting for an air raid warning to pass. The battle damage repair consisted of going back to the ship and the head maintainer, the senior maintainer, getting a roll of Fablon, which is, the stuff that you put on maps, and just putting it over the window. So it basically made the window completely unusable, which in the Wessex, you had limited visibility as it was. And especially if it was raining, the windscreen wipers used to just smear grease and stuff over the windscreen. So you often ended up having to open the very flimsy door and stick your head out, and that was the only way you could fly. But this thing, Yankee Tango, was an absolute shocker to fly, and it got hit because they were too close to the ships. And they didn't want to be too far from the ships because they didn't know what Argentine troops were in the area. And there were some in the region of Fanning Head and Port St. Carlos in the first few days. This is 846 Sea Kings. That's the night flying Sea Kings, actually. And then this is a good illustration of the focus on logistics. This is an 825 Sea King, which arrived at the beginning of June. And it's you can see it's a 825 Sea King because it's the Mark II with a little radome on the back. So they were stripped out. They did a brilliant job. And the troops looked up longingly at the helicopters. They wanted to, they're saying, "Why aren't you flying me?" And the helicopter pilots looked longingly down at the troops and said, "Why am I not flying you?" And the answer was logistics. That was the important thing. Where to park? Parking became a serious problem, actually. If you got back late and it was dark, you were competing with 40 helicopters to go and find a space dotted around St. Carlos. So that gives a bit of a flavour of the parking problem with several Wessex, some Sea Kings, and what else is in there? Yeah, there's Wessex and Sea Kings in that one, and that's Port St. Carlos, which was where we were based for a while. Helicopters were also used in rescues. We all know that. I'll just come on to show some photos of that. That is Sheffield, which some of you here, I'm afraid, will know all too well. And you can tell it's Sheffield and not Coventry, because although they're both Type 42, Sheffield had the bunny ears on the funnel, which the Argentine ones had as well. So actually, once Sheffield had gone, then it meant that if you saw a Type 42 without bunny ears on the funnel, then you knew it was one of ours. And not one of theirs. And that's a Mark V Sea King. This is Hector doing his rescue of Ardent, and that painting is actually in his house, where I was last night. This is, Ardent, that's right, this is Ardent, which was struck several times with two main strikes, and the flight deck was taken out, and with it, sadly, the crew of the Lynx. And two guys found themselves, after the bombs went off, in smoke and mangled metal at the rear, and crawled to the edge and jumped into the sea. Think it's the South Atlantic, 3 degrees, absolutely terrifying, going from fire into freezing. And the helicopter appeared on the scene in the nick of time, armed with one Rick Jolly, who was the senior surgeon at the time, Surgeon Commander Rick Jolly, who set up the field hospital, which was called the Red and Green Life Machine. And he very bravely volunteered to go down into the 3-degree water, take the electric shock from hitting the water, because helicopters build up a huge energy by static electricity, and that discharges through the person who hits the deck. So you have the static shock, and then the other shock of going into this 3-degree water and then doing it again. It was an act of great heroism, which was never properly recognized. This is Antelope after it, kind of iconic shot with a Wessex flying past it. This is Coventry, appallingly upside down, and a couple of 846 Sea Kings. There were other Sea Kings involved, and there were some various Wessex involved in the rescue from that. And that was, I think, about 40 miles north of St. Carlos. This is HMS Plymouth, which got hit on the last attack of the war. And my colleague, Paul McIntosh, is dropping Rick Jolly on the deck to go and deal with a wounded sailor on Plymouth. And then finally, the sort of the iconic famous rescue, which was Galahad and Tristram. We've talked a lot about that, but you know, look, this is just before, this is a photo just before the event. You can see they stick out like the proverbial, and that was the result, with a Mark II Sea King and a Wessex from our squadron involved in the rescue. There were about 6 helicopters, I think, involved in the rescue. That's the reverse picture taken from the Sea King by a guy called Tim Stanning, who used to be boss of used to be a Wessex squadron boss, and he was setting up he was on board the Sea King in order to set up the forward base at Fitzroy, where these ships had just arrived. So we were going to set up a refueling point and all that sort of thing. So that's what he was doing there, and at kind of the wrong moment. That's my colleague Tim Hughes and the late Bill Tutty in a Wessex, and then the famous shot of the 825 Sea Kings blowing the life rafts away from the ship. We were quite rude about 825, I think, when we were there because of sort of within service rivalry stuff. It was all very childish, but actually they did a really good job. And I kind of regret being quite so childish, but there we are. That's a photo I took a day or 2 days later of Galahad, which was towed out to sea and sank on the way. And Tristram was towed round to Navy Point opposite Port Stanley, where we ended up based after the war. We'd gone as garrison squadron, so our job was supposedly, we shouldn't have been involved in it at all, but we did get there with about 10 days to spare. And then we ended up, for our sins, sticking around for 3 months afterwards in the wind and snow and other horrors. And it was utterly beautiful, the Falklands, but you know, you really wanted to be on holiday rather than actually down there for 3 months, unless you live there, of course, or like sheep. This was one of the other jobs that we had as helicopters. One of us got assigned to the field hospital, the Red and Green Life Machine, and to take wounded soldiers of both sides out to the hospital ship, the SS Uganda, parked out in Falkland Sound. And it was a fantastic job, not least because when you got to the Uganda, they had amazing supply of fresh, proper coffee and sausage sarnies. So that was kind of like gold dust. And it was a break from, you know, Pusser's rations and things. And in fact, on this particular day, when it was my job to go and take people from the field hospital out to the hospital ship and then back again. And I did that a number of times for Rick Jolly. I was sitting on the deck pointing in the direction of this photo, it's pointing south, and or southeast. And I saw coming over those hills a couple of Skyhawks. I wasn't 100% sure whether they were Skyhawks or Harriers, but I thought, I have no idea what, in the flash, I thought, I'm in the wrong place here. I'm a big green commando helicopter and I'm on a ship with, you know, white and red crosses. What do I do? What are the rules? What does the Geneva Convention say? But I'm not going to hang around to find out. So I shouted to my crewman, are we clear? And he said, yes, boss. And off we went and we hid. And I hid behind the Uganda. And it was, in fact, as it turned out, it was 2 Skyhawks. But in that moment, when I was sitting in the hover, but sort of right down practically on the water, hiding behind the ship, I thought really, really clever. I felt really, really clever and also really, really stupid at the same time. And then I felt really, really brave. And then I felt really, really cowardly as well. Oh, what a mug. But there we go. Anyway, those 2 Skyhawks, actually, as it turned out, that was the last raid of the war. And they'd just come from Stanley area. And one of our colleagues, Paul McIntosh, was dropping off some ammunition at the gun placement just at the foot of Mount Kent. As he was in the hover over the top of the gun position, about to drop his load, he saw these two jets coming out of over the top of the hill in front from over Mount Longdon, at some hell of a speed. And he watched the bombs drop off the rails, 2 1,000-pound bombs. I mean, can you imagine? You're about to get absolutely vaporized by these things because they're big bang. Anyway, it was thankfully the Argentines hadn't actually dealt with their fusing problem, as it turns out. Otherwise, he wouldn't be here today. So anyway, those jets did their bombs, and they zoomed off, and those were the ones I saw, and I worked that out by a process of elimination. There's another interesting hospital ship incident. This is some of our colleagues, Arthur Balls, who I'm going to talk about again in a minute, who was an air crewman, and then Rick Fox, who ended up as commander at Yeovilton until a few years ago, sticking around for well beyond his sell-by date, and Steve Judd. And they got asked as two junior pilots to do a really stupid mission to fly down into Lafonia in southeast Falkland to go and land on the Argentine hospital ship, which the Brits, some of the command suspected that they may be smuggling in stuff into the Falklands and possibly land-based Exocet missiles. And so they went on and took an inspection team. They got chained to the deck, so they weren't going to go anywhere. So they had this rather odd situation of being on top of sitting on an Argentine ship in the Falklands, sitting down having coffee with these crisp white uniformed Argentine sailors in their smelly jungly greens. It was all very incongruous and surreal, I think Foxy called it. We were very, very flexible in the way we operated. I mean, anyone who's flown with a Fleet Aron knows that that's one of our big things, and we always used to joke about the Air Force a bit about, they have this expression in the Air Force, something like something or other is the key to air power, and we always used to say inflexibility is the key to the Air Force. But flexibility was the key to the Fleet Aron, and I'm joking really, but not really. And this is HMS Andromeda, which was an Exocet firing Leander class frigate. You needed to get stuff onto the deck. It's armed with a Lynx on the back. So it's got a very small deck, and you need to get on there. Well, you make do with what you've got. So this is what I did. This photo was sent to me a couple of years ago, and that's me landing on the back of Andromeda in St. Carlos water. You can tell it's Andromeda because it's got AM on the back. And you see where the bum line is, this sort of the line that goes across at the bottom. That's what I'm supposed to have been on effectively. But way back in order not to wipe out the hangar at the back of the ship. But we landed wheels light, so the oleos aren't fully compressed. So the tail wheel was just about on the edge. And all of us did stupid things. One day I landed on a ship called Geestport, which was a banana boat, literally a banana boat. And the flight deck was absolutely minuscule. I mean, you could barely get a model aeroplane onto it, let alone a big helicopter. But I thought, I've got to get people off. The best way to do that is if I plant one wheel on the side. That's really cool. And so I put one wheel on, and the passenger in the back leapt out and was very grateful he didn't have to go up and down on the winch. Anyway, I made the mistake of telling my boss when I got back, and we got the most almighty bollocking for doing things that were outside my skill set, but I didn't think so anyway. And we all did stupid things. This is fuel. Fuel was quite a shocking problem. I've already talked about the balance that you had to make as a helicopter pilot in the Wessex, and actually later when I flew Wasps. That was always a balancing act with fuel, because you always had to work backwards from where you wanted to be and work out how much fuel you needed at the end of your mission. And then you could work out how much fuel you could put in. You had to sort of work it all backwards. And the same was true here. So we never filled up with full fuel in the Falklands, and we always operated on relatively low levels of fuel so that we could carry more load, which of course led to the major problem that you had to top up quite frequently in order to you had to get yourself up to a sensible level. And our tanks took 2,400 pounds, and I think we were allowed to go down to 400 in peacetime. No, that was the minimum. And I think most of us got down to 100 or 150 at some point and frightened ourselves silly trying to get fuel. This is two Sea Kings on either Fearless or Intrepid, and maybe someone.
It's Fearless. Satellite aerials.
They look absolutely identical to me, but thank you. I don't know. Anyway, they were both friendly ships, and we were pretty good at our recognition, but not at that. And that's and you can see it's like a pinger seeking in the hover, waiting for fuel at the back. But people were pretty gentlemanly. If you were in an absolute panic for fuel, and you shouted on the radio, "I've got absolutely zero fuel left," then the Sea Kings will let you in. Otherwise, they pushed you out of the way. This was also where we refueled at Port St. Carlos, and I think it was called HMS Sheathbill. Someone named it that. And there's the portable Harrier runway, which had a ground attack carrier had lost its undercarriage at the end of the runway there. You can't actually quite see it. There's 2 Sea Harriers on there, and there's a couple of Wessex. There's a Mark II Sea King, and then the Chinook Bravo November there. And you can see in the water this sort of pillow, which actually contained the fuel, was then pumped up to the fuel point. So that was a fantastic bit of resupply for us. And otherwise, we had these fuel stations at Fitzroy on the south side and Teal Inlet on the north side, from these bollocks that were flown up by either 1 at a time by the Sea Kings or 4 at a time by the Chinooks, which was fantastic. Weather was a shocker in the Falklands. This is a couple of weeks after the war. And this is me having just had an engine failure. And the reason I had an engine failure, it was the most beautiful day that morning, and it was after the war. So I and my crewman, the late Al Doughty, decided to go and fly up to 5,000 feet to go and have a view, at which all jungly helicopter pilots get nosebleeds at that altitude and generally don't do it. And so we liked staying down at about 20 or 30 feet, which is where I spent most of my time. And anyway, I had an underslung load. This is a guidance, some sort of guidance controller for the Rapier system. Anyway, a couple of hours after we'd been up high in this clear, beautiful day, blue sky and all that sort of stuff, we were picking up a load, and I was literally flying across St. Carlos water, so not a big distance. And I got halfway across St. Carlos water, and suddenly the world went white in front of me as this snow shower, very violent snow shower, hit. And I thought, oops, we better turn around. So we turned around as fast as you can turn around with a load dangling underneath. Went back, dropped it on the ground there, and then landed next to it so that we could pick it up again afterwards. And sat to wait it out. About 15 seconds later, boom, this snow shower hits. My windscreen goes completely white. The next thing I know, one of the engines is winding down, because in the intake of the Wessex, there's this lip, and the lip filled up with snow, and boom, that all went in. So you can imagine what fun that would have been if we'd been flying across St. Carlos water. Actually, the Wessex flies quite well on one engine, but we could have lost both. Who knows? It was the only time I ever lost an engine in the Falklands. So weather was an absolute shocker. And occasionally during the war, we had the problem that there were icing limitations. And in these snow showers, there's a particular kind of ice called rime ice, which I think is the bubbly kind. Or have I got this the right way around? Someone will correct me. Anyway, there's a couple of different types of ice. One of them's really, really bad, and one's just bad. And if it builds up on your blades, then your aeroplane becomes essentially unflyable, as well as heavier. And so you have to be careful flying in snow showers, especially if within a particular temperature range where it freezes as water on your blades. And that was really tricky if you were flying over a minefield as well, because you're kind of stuck. What do we do? Do we land? Do we keep going? And this was the kind of decisions that we were faced with as young 21-year-olds at the time. Amazing level of responsibility. This was an exciting day I had when I had to go and deliver some stuff to one of the settlements, and the weather was pretty crappy, as it always was. The cloud base was coming down, so I flew around the coast, and I flew along these cliffs, and the cloud base kept coming down lower and lower, and it was really a race to see whether I could get to the end of the cliffs before the cloud base actually hit the ground, and I was flying in fog. Anyway, I just about made it before the waves got me from underneath. And then I ended up in this field, and you can see it was a bit foggy day. One of the other things that happened in the Falklands was that one day, one of the senior Wessex pilot was called in by Mike Rose and asked if he could park an AS-12 on General Menendez's breakfast table, and they thought this was a jolly good idea. So they collected a guy called Pete Stanley and his air crewman Arthur Balls, who we saw earlier, and they had literally, they flew through the gloop on a gloopy day, which is what they wanted, and they fired two AS-12s at Port Stanley, and the result was that it actually missed its primary target and flew down an alleyway and into the police station. But actually, as it turned out, General Menendez wasn't having his breakfast at the time at that point, because the SAS were watching from the ridge, and so they could see what was going on. So they thought this was a good idea to remove the entire Argentine high command on the ground. That was his, his great plan, and it was a very good plan. But unfortunately, it didn't work. But I think it was only a day later, he was telling me at lunch, that he was then on the radio, on the walkie-talkie or whatever it was, with Menendez from wherever he was. So that was that. The second AS-12 went into the harbour, but it was good fun. And there they are. That's on the right is Pete Manley, who was the pilot, and on the left is Arthur Balls, the air crewman, and a nice piece of artwork. And you can figure out the cover of my book is actually an artistic view of the head-on view. Pucaras were the terrifying threat. My version of minimizing the terrifying threat after the war was that somebody had said to me that, hey, Harry, you know these Pucaras, they've got their noses in the ground because they've all been blown up. And this is at Goose Green. They said, what you can do is you can, and I didn't know if they'd done it or not, but I thought, what they said, what you can do is you can, if you put your wheel on the tail of the Pucara, you can push it down, and so that the nose comes up, and you can end up look like that. And the Pucara looks quite normal then, and normally threatening. And I thought this was very good, except of course, once I got to there and the guy had taken a couple of happy snaps of me, I thought, what the hell do I do now? Because I'm now stuck with this airplane, which is going to go boom straight up and take my flotation cans off my wheels, which it jolly nearly did. Anyway, I just got away with it by the skin of my teeth. So we were 21, we were very, very good at what we did, but we were also very, very stupid. The final hills, all the helicopters were involved in the final hills. Everybody has a story of being mortared or hit by artillery fire, and I don't really need to go into that. That's a picture of one of our Wessex on Mount Longdon at the regimental aid post of 3 para, and it was just unimaginably awful, and I still can't imagine having to do the attacks on those hills. I think they were spectacularly brave in going uphill against a dug-in enemy and fighting these terrible battles at night. It's spectacularly, astonishingly brave. And we followed a gazelle into Mount Longdon, and because we were on the north side of Mount Longdon in this very steep hill, we couldn't actually get 3 wheels on the ground, so we ended up again plonking 1 wheel on the side of the hill, while the wounded guys were on stretchers were shoved into the back, and I think we spent all of a minute on the ground, having just watched the helicopter in front loading up. But you see, while we were watching them, the Argies were watching us as well. They couldn't just hear us because they were just over the top of the hill on the other side. They also could see us down Wireless Ridge. They were looking at us. So as soon as we arrived on the scene, the artillery fire opens up and they start bracketing us, and there's one there and there's one behind us, and then the next one's on us. And we sat there watching the helicopter in front as the artillery fire started raining down. And this one particular one that I remember landed just in front of them, a ground burst, exploded all the ground and put mud on their windscreen. That's how close it was. And then they buggered off and it was our turn to go in, and we were thinking, ah! And actually, in fact, I was distracting myself saying, where are the Pucaras? Anyway, they weren't anywhere near me. But we were on the ground for about a minute, I think, before we pirouetted out. And I was flying with a guy called Andy Pulford, who was a flight lieutenant at the time and had been involved in the South Georgia insert, who subsequently he was an RAF exchange officer on 845 Squadron. And he subsequently became head of the entire Air Force and became Air Marshal Sir Andrew Pulford, and lots of letters after his name. Really grand. We all get older and we get people. Some people get into very important positions indeed. Others of us stop as a what was known as a gash lieutenant. which is me. Stanley, we got there eventually. Pretty well everybody had the same thought when we saw Stanley. It's not like we were expecting skyscrapers, but it was pretty bloody disappointing. Let's face it. I live in a village in West Somerset called Yeovilton. There's 3,000 people in that village. That's bigger than that, and that's what we were fighting for. So I think realistically, you know, after this whole thing was over, most people, unfairly to the Falkland Islanders, obviously, and with no disrespect to anyone, we were disappointed because that's all there was. So it was a bit of a shocker. After the war finished, we got stuck as garrison squadron, flying stuff and people around. We cornered the market in eggs, which was amazing. We managed to get 100,000 eggs off of various supply ships. So we had this huge bargaining power. A, we could move stuff around, which was wonderful. So, and B, we had something that we could give people in exchange for whatever they wanted to give us. So we used to fly around with all sorts of things. There was one time when one of our crews requisitioned or stole 10,000 Mars bars off the Atlantic Causeway, which was in a locked sort of storeroom and somewhere down in the bowels of the ship. This was the sister ship of Conveyor. But everyone knew these Mars bars were there. But one of the pilots and the air crewman went back armed with a bolt cropper because the supply officer on board the ship said, no, you can't have it. We haven't got the paperwork for the Mars bars, so we'll take them back to the UK. The air crew thought, no, you won't. And they snuck on one day and loaded up their Wessex, having cut the bolts and stuff with 1 million Mars bars. So that was great because we could distribute nutty, as it was called. We could distribute nutty, particularly to the poor old rapier crews who were on the top of the hills, who had the shortest straw of anybody's short straws. Because they were stuck out actually on the top of the hill watching for Argentine air raids. And we took great sympathy. We had great sympathy for the poor old rapier crews. And we used to give them as much as we possibly could every time we visited them. Look, we can see people armed with wellies. We can see the local wildlife as well. This was at Navy Point opposite Stanley, where we ended up at the end with Sir Tristram in the background. Sir Tristram, it was awful. You had this thing here, you had the promise of a nice warm shower, wonderful. But if you went in for a shower, you also had to deal with the smell. And it's something that still horrifies me to this day, is the smell of burning that we went in. So I had this sort of permanent daily battle with myself. Do I go in and get clean on the outside and have a shower? Because if I do, I'm going to come out stinking on the inside with this indelible smell sort of seared into my brain. And I think often for a lot of us, what happened afterwards was very often worse than what happened during, because during, battle happens and things explode and people get shot at and you see bodies and you see wounded people and it's all very nasty, but you're kind of, your belly button's tightened for it. But afterwards, you kind of relax your guard. And there was a couple of weeks after this thing finished, my squadron were involved in an appalling accident where a Harrier loosed off a Sidewinder missile into the poor old Welsh Guards, and various people lost their limbs. And I don't think anyone was killed in it, but you'll tell me if I'm right. I think the Sidewinder missile is basically a fairly small charge in the front with an expanding wire thing. So that's why people lost their limbs, because this thing exploded and the wire expands and just cut people up. My squadron had some very traumatic time picking up the pieces of these poor Welsh Guardsmen and taking them to the various field hospital and the various hospital ships. And I, the next day, had to go and pick up a young soldier off one of the hospital ships. There were 3, because there was Uganda and there were a couple of other smaller ones. And I think it was on Uganda. And this stretcher comes out. So I'm sitting on deck, very relaxed. And out comes this guy on a stretcher, looking very young, younger than me, and looking sort of pretty pleased with life. And I'm thinking, I wonder what's happened to him. The downdraft from my helicopter blows up his blanket and he's got no limbs. And I retched. And that lives with me to this day. And when I have my particular ghost, that's the thing that gets me, and has for years. Appalling. So it was a grim old thing. We got home eventually. That's me and my mum, and then we ended up 20 years later sitting in a pub after no one had talked about this thing, sitting in a pub talking for the first time and telling our stories to each other, and hence that's what I'm here telling you about. Thank you very much.
said something earlier on, I think, about old men making wars and young men fighting them. And that's very much what Harry's story, I think, is about. General Samai and John talked about what it was like to be a mature officer. We've just heard what it's like to be a slightly immature officer, being given an expensive helicopter to fly around in, sadly, a battleground.
Yeah.
But a story incredibly valuable, I think, for a day like this, and very, very worthwhile. Questions for Harry, please.
I've got two technical questions.
Sure.
Really. I mean, we arm helicopters with a 762 GPMG.
Yes.
Range just over 1,000 yards, 1,200. Yet you've got someone on the ground with a 762, maybe GPMG. You're the big target, they're the small target. Shouldn't you consider half-inch and bigger weapons as opposed to messing around with a pea shooter?
Well, it was above my pay grade as to what weapons were fitted. Yeah. The question was for those online was about were we fitted with enough weaponry in our helicopters? I mean, to my knowledge, none of the our crewmen who had cabin-mounted GPMGs, some of them on both sides, some of them on just on one side. I don't think anyone ever actually used them in anger. I have a feeling they may have been used against some of the wildlife afterwards to let off steam, but I don't think they were actually ever used in anger. There was a talk at one point of fitting one of the Wessex with rocket pods, and they tried them on the way down. We used to fire rockets from our Wessex, which was great fun to do, but their ineffectiveness was pretty astonishing because there's a training range up in South Wales called Castle Martin that you obviously know because the Harriers used it as well. And there's a tank sort of on the edge of the cliff, an old World War II tank, which is still there because the rockets were so utterly inaccurate. So, yeah, I mean, if we'd had more weaponry, great. But frankly, it wasn't our prime thing. Our prime thing was to shift people and stuff around the place.
You said you had a second question.
Yeah, the second part.
I was just going to say, before you do, the counterpoint to that question and answer is some years ago, my then education officer was putting a course on about what today's fleet air arm were doing that had an impact on society. And the focus of that particular day was going to be the Caribbean guard ship controlling drug smuggling. And 815 were up just 2 hangars up there with links, and they used to carry a 50 cal Browning so that they could put a few rounds to the bottom of a fiberglass boat and it would sink in the Caribbean. And the officer who came up here to talk about it was a young lady brunette officer, and she brought this gun in, put it down, and she stroked it and she said, "That's my gun." And we all went, okay, fine, but now the ladies have got 50 cal Brownings and you didn't.
One of my project design exercises was to fit armor plate into the Sea Kings.
Yeah.
And you're putting a lot of weight in.
Yeah.
And then you've got to sacrifice fuel
Yeah.
or personnel.
Yeah.
So what's your opinion about?
Some of our Wessex were fitted with armor plating. Actually, it was
seats.
we had one plate under our bum, and we had one in the window which could fold upwards like that. But it was so heavy, and I'm not kidding. I remember getting into the helicopter and trying to lift this thing up. The angle was so horrible. I actually thought I got very close to asking for help, which would have been a really pansy thing to do, but thankfully I managed to get the thing to shift, but it was really heavy. I felt a lot better having it. Oddly enough though, when Andy Pulford and I did our thing on Longdon, and then in the other hills where we were right in front, we'd see Argentine soldiers in front of us getting bombarded by artillery fire. That was the day when we could have done with a bit of protection. And interestingly, the one time that a Wessex was hit by gunfire was this aircraft Yankee Tango. So not only did it have the fab-long window that didn't protect it against, or the window hadn't protected it against gunfire, but actually it was one of the few helicopters that had armor plating. So it nearly took out the pilot at the time. And So it wasn't hugely effective, is the answer.
Protecting the pilots, I'm talking about more the cabin.
Oh, no, that was just
I
put
mean,
much
that's
too
what
much.
we-
They put much too much weight on it.
That's what they
Yeah.
requested of us, and we used a material called Dyneema,
No, right.
which is basically polythene bags squashed together
Yeah.
and about. But no, I just thought it was a wasted exercise. But
Yeah, probably pretty much a wasted exercise. And also it actually, when, you know, pulling this great lump of metal up beside us, or lead or whatever, I don't know what it was made of, was also, it restricted the visibility out of the window. So not only did I have one window that I couldn't look out of at all, I also have the armor plating on both sides that stopped visibility that way. So it was really quite a difficult day at the office.
Any more?
Chris, given the flying conditions, changeable weather,
Yeah,
the air raids, the number of different squadrons of different types of helicopters,
yes.
I'm surprised there weren't more mid-air collisions. What was sort of air traffic control like, if there was any?
It was the Mark 1 eyeball mostly, and it's a big place, the Falklands. I mean, it doesn't look big when you look at a map, but it's actually quite a big place, and you just had to keep your eyes open. The nearest I got to a collision was, in fact, on Mount Longdon, where we were, the two of our Wessex were going into, flying down a little valley, and we were literally trying to hide an 8-foot high Wessex in a 6-foot deep valley. So we were flying really low. We were right, literally with our wheels practically on the ground. And as we came down, we were waiting to intercept a Gazelle, which was going to lead us into the landing spot and take us into the first aid post of 3 Para. And I watched in slow motion this Gazelle pop out from behind a hill in front of us going, and I honestly thought the aircraft in front was going to crash into it. And I didn't close my eyes, but I just thought I was about to see this most appalling mid-air collision. So it did nearly happen. I mean, thankfully it went past, but it looked awfully close to me from being in the aircraft behind. So that was actually quite a scary moment. But I don't remember any others. Did you ever have it, Hector or Ray? Did you have any near misses? I don't think so, no. No, I mean, the biggest things, the things that really got us were running low on fuel was pretty scary at times. And everyone had their own horror story of mismanaging their fuel. It was just very easy to do. The weather was shocking at times because it would turn so quickly. And in fact, on my very last day in the Falklands, I flew from Port Stanley up to St. Carlos across the hills. And sat in the hover off the ship Rangatira that had brought my replacements at last, and it said 55 knots on the clock, and that was pretty unnerving, actually, quite honestly. And flying late, if we slightly misjudged our tasking in the mountains, we didn't have night goggles, and so flying around in the mountains in the dark was not funny, and most of us had our own little horror stories of flying around in the dark in the mountains. It was really scary. So the trick was definitely to get back, because of course you wanted to keep it going as long as possible, because you wanted to do as much tasking as possible for the people on the ground. And then we were always looking out for Pucaras and wondering when we were going to get taken out by them, and never were, thankfully, apart from the poor old scout.
On a completely different tangent, and I see reference to the picture of you and your mother. How much contact was there with people at home? And did you feel yourself able to tell them how you felt, and were they telling you their feelings either during the time or after?
It was slow, but we used to write these, we have these very, very flimsy little blue airmail letters that went back, and that was your mail. And we got deliveries of mail, and it was very good. We got a lot of mail throughout the whole time, and the mail drops happened during the war, so you could send stuff back and you could get it back. The Hercules on their long range drops would drop them off. That reminds me of a funny story, which I'll tell you in a second. But the mail drops were absolutely wonderful. But they didn't happen very often, and obviously during the war itself, I don't remember it happening at all. It certainly happened afterwards. Yes, I was able to tell people pretty much anything because I didn't know anything terribly interesting. I'm flying around in Dartmoor in February, which is what it basically looked like and felt like, and that's about it. And it's all very exciting. And love Harry. That was it. And so, Lindy Pops.
The mail was withheld. So you were wrong.
Oh, was it?
I got about 5 blueies in one go.
Okay.
I just didn't get anything else in the audience. You didn't know what ship, when you were, or anything. And then it all went
Oh.
on one big back.
That's
So I think it just held it back. So you could be writing what
Yeah.
you wanted. But by the time we booked it, the information was all
That's the lovely Mrs. Heathcote, by the way.
Your
There's a
story.
very funny story happened. You know, inter-service rivalry is a marvelous thing. We were at Navy Point, and we set up a system where you plonked two, because the airfield was being repaired, the runway was being repaired. They wanted to make it longer for the Phantoms to be able to operate from there, and they couldn't under its current system. Not because the RAF missed it so many times with their Vulcan, but because, I'm not kidding, well, most of them did. But anyway, they had to lengthen and strengthen the runway. And while they were doing that, then the only means of only access to the Falklands were these very, very long flights that the Hercules did with a very complicated sort of logistic setup to refuel them umpteen times. And part of what they did was they dropped all their stuff that they needed to drop, but they also did a pickup. They did a melee pickup. And we used to go and set up the melee pickup. We used to drop someone out in the middle of nowhere on a nice bit of open ground, and you'd put 2 sticks in the ground and a bit of string, and the Hercules would fly low, dangling a hook behind, and would pick up this thing. So the male would get back, and then it was flown all the way back to, it was winched in and then flown up to Ascension Island. Anyway, we heard this story from Ascension Island that there were rumours of the RAF, or the crabs as everyone calls them, of the crabs pilfering stuff at Ascension Island. And so we heard about this down at Navy Point, and we were quite concerned about that. We obviously, you know, we thought, bloody RAF nicking stuff, you know, while we're down here at the sharp end. Anyway, the mailies went back, and someone, as a joke, put a cow's head into the mail bag. And obviously this reached the attention of the group captain at Ascension Island, who sent a very shirty signal down to Commander Land Forces Falkland Islands saying, this is utterly irresponsible of you, and no, this is expensive missions, it's an enormous logistical exercise, blah, 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 you know, and to send a cow's head is utterly appalling. To which the reply from Commander Land Forces Falkland Islands was, cow's head, we send a whole cow. I think with that, I'd probably better stop.
I was going to try and avoid inter-service rivalry, but you've really blown it now.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are RAF officers online, but
I love you dearly.
Richard's saying we've got a couple of questions online, I think.
Yeah, just very quickly. I do apologise, I just unmute myself. People are saying how personal your story is, Harry, and they appreciate that.
Thank you.
For that. And an excellent presentation, etc. One question was, how did the helicopter force manage for engineering supplies and serviceability?
Oh, engineering supplies and serviceability, brilliantly was the answer. I mean, our engineers were fabulous. They did an absolutely amazing job. The Wessex was a glorious machine. Once you got it started, it would run forever. It was just getting it started was hard work, because it didn't like the cold, damp air. Yeah, you're banging it with your feet. Yeah, to get the crackers going, to fire up the whole, you know, the jet engines under your feet. So the machines flew absolutely brilliantly once they were working. And we made do with a lot of problems. So the dreaded Yankee Tango I was telling you about, with a Fablon windscreen that you couldn't see out of, and the armor plating that meant you couldn't see out the side windows either, if you could lift them into place in the first place. It had one of the fuel gauges was broken, so you had to guess how much fuel was on board. So you had to hope like mad that your 2 fuel tanks were going down at the same rate. And so that was quite exciting. We also there was another pressure gauge which wasn't working. We would just have to make do with that. And also the platform on the rotor head was wire locked shut. Normally, part of a pilot's job before he or she gets into the aircraft, we were all he's then, obviously. Not that we've transitioned into anything else, but anyway, I'm deviating. Anyway, we would climb up the side of the helicopter and open the platform in order to have a look at the oil levels and make sure there's nothing that shouldn't be there, and that the levels were all right. But of course, if your platform's wire locked, then you've just got to trust that the engineers have topped up the tank, and then it's actually going to be all right. Otherwise, you'll be flying along happily, and then suddenly the engine goes, and the blades stop rotating, and you end up going downhill very quickly. But thankfully that never happened. So we made do with a lot of stuff. The engineering was wonderful. And occasionally a helicopter would get beyond redemption, at which point it became what was known as a Christmas tree, where it was basically, it was a spare parts store, and people took, the engineers took whatever bits off they needed to go and repair other machines. So they did an absolutely amazing job, because I don't remember ever being faced with major problems of maintenance because our helicopters weren't working enough. I mean, we had pretty much one helicopter per pilot, so we were well below what we should have been. So some of the time we were flying 2 pilots in the cockpit. We didn't need 2 pilots in the Wessex. Sea Kings did need 2 pilots if something went catastrophically wrong. They needed a pilot to operate the throttles while the other one's flying the thing. I never flew a Sea King, so I don't know how it works, but on the Wessex, you could do pretty much anything with just 1 pilot. And so a lot of the time we were on our own. My first day in the Falklands, we did a battalion lift of Gurkhas from Goose Green up to Fitzroy, past those burning ships, and I've just shown you. And I went with one of the more senior guys, who was probably all the grand age of 24 or 25, acted as my mentor for the day and showed me the ropes. And he said, right, this is where you land and this is where you go. And then we swapped seats, and he said, right, you're in the captain's seat now, the right seat in a helicopter, and now you're off on your own. So there was me, age 21, and my first mission in the Falklands on my Todd. So we were given an awful lot of responsibility, but the machines were wonderful. They never really went wrong, not that I remember anyway. Oh, I had 3 days running. I had that engine failure from the snow, which wasn't really the engine's fault. And I had the day before, I had a primary hydraulics failure. The day after, I had a secondary hydraulics failure. If they'd both gone at the same time, I wouldn't be here, because you can't control 7 tons worth of lift in your blades with just your bare hands. You just can't move 7 tons. You need a hydraulic system. In fact, you need 2. And so I lost them both on consecutive days, which was kind of fortuitous. Can you imagine?
Okay. Commercial repeat. Harry has got some copies of Scram. If you haven't got it, please help him pay for your son's acting career.
And I'll happily deface them for you. If
the museum's also selling some outside, and over by Richard we have a painting of, I think, the only one Wessex 3 that was out there, Humphrey from Antrim, on Fortuna Glacier, which is painted by Dan Hedger, a SOFAM member. Chris Parry is coming towards the end of the month to do an event around Humphrey, which is on display just out there. And you can order them for signing by Chris Parry as a limited edition print today. And so that's the end of the commercial break. 15 minutes comfort break and stuff, and back then for Commodore Neil Thomas. But I think it was a very personal review there, Harry, and absolutely brilliant contribution to the day. Thank you very much.